Hello, I'm Newsflash. Welcome on board the Sun Express. And as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Now, in this episode, we're unpacking a conundrum wrapped in an enigma, doused in secrecy and served cold. Russian counter-terrorism and technology tactics. Now, imagine a world where we must deal with the devil isn't just a cheeky phrase, but a stark geopolitical reality. That's the script the US and Russia are currently writing. Because even when your adversary is doing his best to cause havoc worldwide, there are issues you can't see eye to eye on. Let's delve deep into Russia's shadowy world where the lines between devil and angel blur in the geopolitical haze. But first, here is our latest report to allow you to catch a glimpse of the situation.
U.S.-Russian relations are at the lowest point since the Cold War. Almost all high-level dialogue between the two countries has been suspended. There are no signs that the relationship will improve in the near future. However, both nations still engage in some areas of cooperation. The U.S. and Russia have a history of bilateral agreements aimed at reducing the nuclear arsenals and promoting global stability. Notable agreements include the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, commonly referred to as START. Another area is counter-terrorism. The U.S. warned Moscow that ISIS militias were determined to target Russia in the days before assailants stormed the Crocus City Hall in an attack that killed scores of people, although President Vladimir Putin rejected the advice as a provocative. The US and Russia have also a long-standing partnership in space exploration, including joint missions and shared use of the International Space Station. Despite geopolitical tensions, this area has remained a symbol of successful collaboration. However, Russia intensified its hybrid warfare tactics against Western nations, employing a blend of military and non-military strategies to undermine security and stability. This multi-phased approach combines conventional military operations with subversive tools like cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, and political interference. NATO has raised alarms over hostile Russian activities across Europe, pointing to a range of disruptive actions from disinformation to sabotage, like GPS signal jamming or even election meddling. The ongoing conflict underscores the evolving nature of modern warfare, where the battleground extends beyond the physical realm into the digital and psychological spaces. The West's response will be crucial in shaping the outcome of this silent war, where resilience and adaptability are a key to maintaining security and sovereignty.
Mr. President, do you have a message for the protesters on campus?
And now, as always, it's time to take a look at the issue in greater detail. So, let's begin. The United States, despite its chilly relations with Russia due to ongoing war in Ukraine, found itself warning Russia about a potential terrorist threat. What ensued wasn't grateful cooperation at all, but instead a cynical brush-off by the Russian officials. Now, why does this matter? Because this isn't just about preventing an attack on Moscow's Crocus City Hall. It's about a tangled web of international relations where today's enemy could be tomorrow's informant. The attack, which Russia failed to prevent despite the heads-up, raises critical eyebrows on the utility and even morality of such warnings. Like, should we be aiding a regime that parades terror suspects before cameras with visible signs of torture evident for all to see? Now, switching gears, let's talk tech. Russia's fingerprints are smeared all across a recent spate of aircraft jamming incidents. That's right, GPS signals going bonkers, not due to solar flares, but due to a very earthly source based, you've guessed it, in Moscow. These disruptions aren't just pranks, they are a silent scream in the world of electronic warfare, a demonstration of Russia's prowess and a preview of what might lie ahead in modern warfare. This isn't a minor inconvenience either, it's a major security risk threatening civil aviation safety across the globe. So, what is exactly at stake here, you may ask? Both these scenarios, the counter-terrorism warnings and the GPS jamming, are facets of a larger Russian strategy to flex its muscles on the international stage. On one hand, Russia remains a gatekeeper in the global fight against terror, a necessary evil in a world where the enemy of my enemy could, in fact, be my friend, or at least, a frenemy, Tom and Jerry style. On the other hand, the Kremlin is pioneering the latest chapter in asymmetrical warfare, where the battlefield isn't just on land, but in the very airwaves that guide our planes. This puts the United States and its allies in a precarious position. Engage with Russia and you risk empowering a regime that doesn't play by the rules. Ignore it and you leave a vacuum that could lead to catastrophic intelligence failures and security breaches. As we navigate through these murky waters, one thing remains clear. Russia seems to be playing 3D chess, while the world is, at least currently, trying to catch up. Whether it's in the realm of counter-terrorism or technological warfare, the game is on, and Russia is making some unfortunate moves that could redefine the rules of engagement for years to come. And joining us now to shed more light on this story is Elizabeth Braw, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of Goodbye Globalization. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you.
So let's begin with grey zone aggression. This story, right, it's not really a whodunit in a traditional sense, it's more like whydunit, isn't it? Everyone knows that it's Russia doing this, that it's Russia actually responsible for GPS jamming in the area around the Baltic Sea. But why do you think they're actually doing this? Is this really an act of hybrid aggression? Or perhaps they are doing it inadvertently, knowing full well that it's going to cause problems, but it's not their main intent?
Well, first of all, it is a bit of whodunit because it's very hard to prove beyond reasonable doubt and with essentially with incontrovertible proof that it is the Russian state that's behind it. And that is the first challenge Western countries. We can say, open source intelligence researchers have located the jammer. It's in such and such place. It's usually in Kaliningrad. It's in Kaliningrad, and so Russia is behind it. Well, we then, if we say this is where the jamming comes from, we then have to be able to prove that it's the Russian state that's behind it. Because you could also, if you were Russia, you could say, well, anybody can operate a jammer in Kaliningrad, and so these are the first hurdles for Western governments.
Do you think that, theoretically, because that's a very interesting point, actually, do you think that there is any sort of civilian technology which could be operated by any sort of rogue actor, by a third party? Judging by the range, it would have to be quite impressive in terms of its overall capacity and range, right?
It is impressive, but that's why governments that wish us harm have proxies. They can ask groups to do things that the state itself doesn't want to do. That's why hostile states have hacker groups that hack on their behalf. So even if we identify the hacker group that's behind a serious hack on Western targets, then it's still just a group, right? I mean, you can't say it was the Russian government, the Chinese government, the North Korean government, and the Iranian government.
Plausible deniability.
Exactly. It's a huge challenge, and that's why it's such a convenient strategy and, frankly, a very efficient strategy for them to operate through proxies. Because how are we going to find the evidence that it is, in this case, the Russian state that's behind it? There may not even be any sort of email chain back and forth between the Russian state and whoever operates that jammer, if indeed that is what's behind the jamming. That's the first thing our governments would have to establish. And if I were the Russian state, I would not have any sort of email trail back and forth between me and the perpetrator of various forms of grey zone aggression. I would just do it with a handshake. And that way, we as Western governments will never be able to prove that I as the Russian government, am behind it.
So that's the first problem, isn't it? Causality, establishing causality. But if it is the Russian state, could they just say, look, we are actually jamming potential drone attacks? This was suggested by a few officials that they want to prevent, and I'm quoting from memory, potential Ukrainian drone attacks against Kaliningrad. Now, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? Why would Ukraine attack Kaliningrad? Wouldn't this cause too many problems for them? I mean, the drones, if they were sent against targets in Kaliningrad, they would have to fly above territories of uninvolved parties. Wouldn't that cause just too many issues for Ukraine itself to be even worth contemplating?
It would, and also Kaliningrad is not exactly a priority target for Ukraine. If Ukraine does have any strong priority targets in Russia, those targets are elsewhere, namely places from which Russia launches various attacks on Ukraine. Kaliningrad is not a place that Ukraine that is troubling Ukraine a great deal, and that Ukraine would sacrifice a lot to target, and by targeting Kaliningrad, if Ukraine were to do it, it would jeopardize its good relationships with, as you say, a number of NATO member states. But the important thing here is that the Russian government is stepping up its rhetoric, and we'll see more of that with the news that a Russian think tank has been hired to do a couple of reports for the Russian government about how to counter Western involvement. And he is known to advocate nuclear rhetoric and possibly even nuclear action. I don't think it would ever come to nuclear action, but he is somebody who likes to ramp up the rhetoric, the nuclear rhetoric, and so we'll see more of that. Indeed, we are already beginning to see
We are.
more of it.
I mean, more Russian cyber rattling. But coming back to the situation with the GPS jamming, do you think that it could actually get worse? If it is intentional, if Russia is just testing our resilience, testing our response, do they have the capacity to completely paralyze civilian aviation in the area, and perhaps extending the area covered by the operations of these jammers? What would happen then? At which point do you think NATO would be forced to respond to this? Do we even have the tools? I mean, in your article for the Center for European Policy Analysis, you're mentioning quite rightly that it is a very awkward position, right? Because it is not really aggression, and so NATO members might just be forced to sit it out somehow. What are the options here?
That is the really acute dilemma when it comes to grey zone aggression, which is what this is, aggression in the grey zone between war and peace. And it's clear to the targeted countries that they are being harmed. And if an airline has to cancel or suspend a whole route as a result of something of aggression coming from another country, that is definitely concrete harm, but yet it's not military aggression, and as a result we don't have a way to counter it. And
the damage is economic, right? I mean, the damage is economic, and it's often going to be private parties involved in that. I mean, Lukashenko brought down isn't the right word. He forced an airliner to land in order to get his hands on an opposition activist. That was not considered to be a direct act of aggression, was it?
No, it was not, and it's yet another example of why grey zone aggression is such brilliant strategy. You can cause considerable harm. It's clear to the countries, to the private companies, to the citizens that they are being harmed, but there is no obvious answer to what to do about it, because we as Western countries are just not going to jam Russian civil aviation in response. It's very, very dangerous to jam aviation operations. It's not something that responsibly thinking countries do, and as a result, we are in a massive bind. We know that it's happening. We would like to respond, but we have certain requirements that we place on ourselves as liberal democracies, as ethically acting countries. We don't just respond in the manner in which we have been attacked, and this is massively relevant, because people say, well, NATO should respond. Well, NATO responds to military aggression. This is not a military act of aggression, so it's not NATO's department, and it's totally unclear, in fact, who should respond, which government department, and then what they should do, considering that they can't just respond in kind.
Well, it's a fascinating dilemma. Before we actually move on to another thread which I would like to touch upon, it's like with cyber attacks. The question is, should the West also have private agencies specializing in this kind of cyber warfare and retaliating against Russian acts of aggression in cyberspace? Well, that's an open question. But I would like to ask you actually about something slightly different that we've mentioned on the program today earlier on. What are the areas that you would say the US and Russia, perhaps NATO, still feel comfortable cooperating in? It seems like counter-terrorism activities might be on the list, perhaps space exploration too. Is there anything else? And does this cooperation even make sense today?
You're absolutely right about counterterrorism and especially space operations. They are still collaborating. NASA and the European Space Agency and the Russian Space Agency are still cooperating in space. And remarkably, that cooperation is not just alive but functioning quite well. So that's one area. I think the other area is climate change. We need Russia to be part of any sort of agreements that we manage to reach about reducing CO2 emissions and adapting to climate change. Then one other area that where there is still positive potential and possible collaboration is the health of the Baltic Sea. So the environmental health of the Baltic Sea, which is obviously where Kaliningrad is located, and Russia unfortunately contributes considerable amounts of wastewater and other pollutants to the Baltic Sea, and we need to work, we as Baltic Sea countries, or the Baltic Sea countries, I should say, need to work with Russia to reduce environmental harm to the Baltic Sea, because it is a sea on which every Baltic Sea country depends, and it's a very small ocean, and it's a very polluted ocean, and there is so much room for collaboration there.
Well, an ocean, perhaps a NATO lake, as some people have. NATO lake, sorry. Freudian slip. But anyway, NATO obviously fighting Russian disinformation online is the sort of little sidekick to NATO that we've already mentioned on this program. So one very quick final question. Environmental issues. Now, the carbon footprint of the war in Ukraine is considerable. So this sounds like, this cooperation going in one direction, but reality going in the other.
That is definitely the case. And unfortunately, every war is not just terrible because it's a war, but also because it creates massive amounts of CO2 emissions. And I would like somebody to monitor the CO2 emissions stemming from this war, so that we can then hold Russia to account, not just whenever this war is over, not just for having brought massive destruction to Ukraine, but also for having brought massive destruction to the environment. And I should add that this is one area where we are seeing an unnecessary increase in CO2 emissions at the moment. The other area is the Red Sea, where the Houthis' attacks on global shipping have resulted in shipping going around the Cape of Good Hope, and as a result, causing a considerable increase in CO2 emissions.
And that's an excellent point. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. So Ukraine is actually compiling ecocide reports about the war, so this perhaps could be helpful in the future. Elizabeth Brough was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
Moving on now to Eastern Newsflash, bringing you all the other stories from the East that you really don't want to miss. The Prime Minister of Norway announced support for Moldova in energy, education and civil society development, following a meeting with Moldovan President Maja Sandu in Oslo. The Norwegian government has also announced plans to open a diplomatic mission in the country, further solidifying the bilateral ties between the two nations.
Norwegian aid amounting to 30 million euros will be dispersed from the Nansen Fund, named after the renowned Norwegian explorer and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Fridtjof Nansen. Last year, Moldova received nearly 69 million euros from Norway, ranking as the seventh largest recipient of development aid. Previous assistance mainly focused on humanitarian issues related to the influx of Ukrainian refugees into Moldova. Both countries have also signed a memorandum to strengthen cooperation, aiming to secure alternative energy sources for Moldova, particularly amid the necessity to reduce dependence on Russian gas. Currently, the only region in Moldova reliant on Russian gas is the separatist-controlled Transnistria. Maja Sandu's visit to Norway marks the first ever by a Moldovan head of state. President Sandu was received in audience by King Harald V and delivered a lecture at the University of Oslo.
On the 9th of May, as the world commemorates the end of World War II in Europe in 1945, all 5 Central Asian presidents are slated to attend a parade on the Red Square in Moscow. The event comes amidst global condemnation of Russia's continued, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and deteriorating relations between NATO and Moscow.
Under Putin's leadership, Russia has made significant efforts to honor the memory of World War II, commonly referred to as the Great Patriotic War in Russia, which claimed the lives of over 20 million Soviet citizens. The revival of the military parade on Red Square and the emphasis on commemorating this historic event have been central to Russia's national identity under Putin's more than two-decade-long rule. Foreign attendance at the May 9th celebration has dwindled since Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine in 2014. The following year, in 2022, no foreign leaders participated in the World War II commemorations in Moscow. An aide to Russian President Vladimir Putin confirmed that this year presidents of all Central Asian countries will be present at the commemorative event. Leaders from Cuba, Laos and Guinea-Bissau are also expected to attend. The Kremlin announced that following the parade, Putin will hold separate talks with leaders of some of the countries. However, Armenian President Nikol Pashinyan, who attended last year's celebrations, will not be participating this year.
Estonia's parliament has issued a strong condemnation of the Moscow Patriarchate, the governing body of the Russian Orthodox Church. The statement accuses the Patriarchate of justifying and supporting Russia's aggression in Ukraine, labeling it a sponsor of Russia's military efforts.
Estonia's parliament condemns Russia's war and territorial annexations, highlighting President Putin's regime as a major threat to global peace. They also specifically criticize Patriarch Kirill of Moscow for his public support of the war. In its statement, the parliament further accuses the Moscow Patriarchate of using the Russian world ideology to promote the war and justify territorial expansion. This ideology, as per statement, is used to weaken Russian democracy, militarize society, and target former Soviet territories like Ukraine. The parliament expresses concern that the Patriarchate rhetoric poses a direct threat to Estonia's security and social order. They urge the international community to take action against the Moscow Patriarchate's hostile influence operations. Importantly, the statement clarifies that the condemnation targets the institution and its leadership, not individual Orthodox believers.
Dutch Defense Minister Kajsa Ollongren unveiled plans to dispatch F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. This strategic move comes in the wake of Denmark's scheduled deliveries this summer.
The transfer of F-16s from Denmark and the Netherlands was greenlit by the United States last August, subject to the completion of pilot training. Dutch Defense Minister outlined a comprehensive plan which encompasses pilot training, maintenance personnel training and the delivery of aircraft. Training centers in Romania and other locations are instrumental in preparing Ukrainian personnel for the operation of F-16s. Denmark is slated to kickstart deliveries this summer, with the Netherlands poised to join in autumn. However, media reports suggest that only a fraction of the promised F-16s from European allies may be delivered by that time.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.